Mystery always sounds louder when it comes from a time before memory. And one of the deepest mysteries of our species is this: why, sometime around 14,000 years ago, long before kingdoms or kings, before metal blades or written laws, small scattered bands of humans, who had survived for hundreds of thousands of years, mostly through cooperation, suddenly began fighting organized intentional wars. We know they did, because archaeologists uncover skeletons with embedded stone points, mass death sites at ancient wetlands, and signs of deliberate boundary defense. But the more haunting mystery is why this began when it did. Tonight, we drift backward into that moment, moving gently through the 15 currents of this story. How shadows before the first spear emerged, how melting ice brought new tensions, how crowded rivers pushed crowded minds, how scarcity calculations sharpened, how weapons subtly shifted in purpose, how a marsh settlement became the spark, how leaders and followers formed their earliest roles, how fear became shared currency, how alliances rose in the tall grass, how the cost of violence was counted, how lines of territory formed in dust, how the fallen were remembered, how skirmish became strategy, how the first truce taught restraint, and finally, why war never fully left us. And with that map laid out, the story lengthens its stride and begins. It opens in a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant, a world still brushed by the chill of the late Pleistocene, but warming quickly enough to unsettle everything. Nights were quieter then, pierced only by animal calls and the soft hiss of wind across open plains. But beneath the quiet ran tension, unnoticed at first, subtle as a tightening thread in the dark. I guide you now into that world, where human footsteps pressed into damp soil long before the word territory existed. Yet the feeling of ownership was beginning to take shape, one cautious glance and one anxious decision at a time. Long before any spear was lifted with intent, there were only faint signs, shadows before the first spear, that something was changing inside the human story. For most of our species' existence, cooperation outperformed conflict. Bands were small, often fewer than 36 people, connected by kinship and the shared urgency of survival. They roamed widely, following herds, gathering roots and berries, and rarely meeting strangers. When they did, it was unpredictable, sometimes friendly, sometimes cautious, but rarely structured as deliberate violence. Early humans defended themselves, yes, but they did not yet wage war. But around 14,000 years ago, the world itself began tightening the frame. The ice sheets retreated in great shimmering walls, releasing water that reshaped valleys, swelled rivers, and opened paths that had been closed for millennia. The herds that once roamed widely began shifting routes, seeking fresh grazing grounds. And as environments changed, human groups, once scattered, found themselves moving toward the same desirable places: riverbanks rich with fish, wetlands full of migratory birds, or forests where game remained steady even in seasonal droughts. These meeting points were beautiful but tense, the way a calm lake surface hides the slow swirl of currents beneath. As our ancestors drifted into these shared landscapes, they brought with them the accumulated memory of hardship. A failed hunt, a harsh winter, a sudden scarcity of edible plants. These experiences etched caution deeply into the mind. When two bands approached the same water source at the same time, each group carried not only hope, but fear. Fear of losing access to food, fear of being pushed away, fear of meeting people whose intentions were unknowable. That fear alone wasn't war, but it was the soil where war could grow. Archaeological evidence from this period shows subtle changes in how humans prepared their tools. Microliths, tiny sharp stone blades, became more standardized and more frequently produced in clusters that fit neatly into composite weapons. Atlatl dart points became longer, more aerodynamic, more capable of traveling distances that exceeded hunting needs. In settlements across regions from the Levant to Central Africa, grave goods show increasing numbers of individuals buried with projectiles still lodged in their bones. The pattern is faint at first, like the first few drops of rain before a storm, but it is enough to tell us something. Intention was forming. Yet in these earliest moments, conflict was not inevitable. Many groups managed to share space temporarily, relying on gestures, distance, and the universal language of firelight to maintain peace. They traded small items, ochre, shells, shaped tools, hints of cultural expression. They observed one another from afar with the wary respect of predators meeting at the edge of a clearing. But peace, especially between strangers, requires predictability, and the world of 14,000 years ago was the opposite of predictable. Climate swung wildly, seasons shifted, a good year could turn to famine in months, and when famine loomed, fear hardened. Hunger compresses morality down to the size of a single urgent need, and that need often overrides the hesitation that keeps hands steady. It was in this crucible that the first deliberate conflicts began to simmer, not full wars yet, but hostile encounters, warning shots of a new human behavior. If we listen closely to that ancient world, we can almost hear the turning of a hinge in the darkness, a quiet change in the human mind that would echo for tens of thousands of years. But for now we remain in the calm before the clash, where glowing campfires reflected in wary eyes, where footsteps along the riverbank left overlapping trails, and where the earliest seeds of conflict lay scattered across the earth, waiting for the moment when necessity would water them into something more organized, more intentional, and more enduring than anything humanity had faced before. Around 14,000 years ago, global temperatures rose sharply, and the vast white walls that had dominated northern horizons for tens of thousands of years started melting at a pace too quick for comfort. Rivers surged with meltwater, carving new channels. Lakes overflowed and then withdrew. Forests spread into former tundra, crowding out the grazing lands that herds had relied on for generations. In this instability, the first pressures that would push humans toward conflict started whispering through the air, soft but persistent. For hunter-gatherers who had survived the harshest cold of the Ice Age, the warming should have been a blessing. And in some ways, it was. New plants emerged earlier each spring, animals expanded their ranges, and once frozen landscapes opened up new opportunities. But the transition itself was chaotic. The dependable rhythms of the Pleistocene were replaced with sudden droughts, unexpected floods, and animal migrations that shifted unpredictably. Humans had always adapted, but now adaptation required faster decisions and closer competition with other groups facing the same uncertain future. As ice retreated, fertile regions became magnets. River valleys like those near the ancient Nile channels or along the Jordan Rift transformed into lush corridors. Wetlands grew thick with reeds and fish, herds clustered around shrinking watering holes, and humans followed. What had once been wide, empty distances between tribes narrowed until their footprints mingled along the same riverbanks. For the first time in many generations, isolation was no longer the norm. People encountered strangers more often, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily, and each contact carried a fragile tension that could tip toward cooperation or conflict. These frequent encounters brewed unease. Imagine two small bands approaching a bend in the river at dusk. Each group sees the smoke of the other's fire curling upward, each hears unfamiliar voices carried by the wind, and suddenly both realize that this patch of land, this tiny stretch of dependable water, cannot fully support them both. That realization is sharp, instinctive, and heavy. This was a world in which one bad season could starve an entire clan, so every choice carried the weight of survival. Even peaceful meetings carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Archaeologists studying this period observe a striking pattern. More defensive injuries on skeletons, more embedded stone points, more abrupt shifts in settlement locations. These clues tell us that the increased contact between groups was not always friendly. At first, many of these encounters likely took the form of standoffs, long, silent hours where each group watched the other carefully, ready to retreat or advance depending on the slightest misinterpreted gesture. Tensions rose even without direct violence, simmering like water set just below the boiling point. Animal migrations also contributed to the pressure. As the climate warmed, some species moved northward faster than others, breaking the old hunting patterns that humans depended on. Bison, horses, reindeer, once plentiful across vast open plains, began shifting into narrower corridors, and where animals concentrated, humans followed. At certain river crossings, choke points formed, narrow trails where herds passed through seasonally, offering immense opportunity but also intense competition. Groups that had once hunted peacefully in distant territories now found themselves forced into the same spaces at the same times. Social stress began to change human behavior. Bands started scouting more often, sending small parties ahead to check who occupied a valley before the larger group moved in. Some early groups may have avoided places entirely if they saw signs, fresh footprints, abandoned hearths, broken reeds, that others had been there recently. But avoidance had limits. When resources dwindled, when children cried from hunger, when elders recognized the signs of an approaching lean season, choices narrowed. Moving to a river, even if another group was already there, sometimes became the only option. During this period, evidence suggests that small symbolic markers appeared, arrangements of stones, tall sticks driven into soil, patterns carved into bark. These early boundary signals were not full territorial claims yet, but they expressed a new idea. This place is ours for now. Approach with caution. But symbols alone could not solve hunger. With the world warming rapidly and ecosystems shifting faster each decade, these markers were often ignored, misunderstood, or deliberately challenged. The psychological landscape was shifting too. Humans began to store stories of rival groups in their collective memory. Children grew up hearing warnings, "Those people by the river will not share," or "The clan with the red ochre marks hunts the same herd we do." Fear transmitted through stories can linger longer than actual encounters, and in a time of instability, these warnings shaped how young hunters interpreted the world. A stranger didn't just represent a mystery, they represented a potential threat to food, safety, and stability. And yet, even in all this tension, the situation was not simple. Many exchanges between groups were peaceful, moments of shared waterholes, silent acknowledgments, cautious trade of small goods like shells or plant fibers. But these fragile achievements were constantly at risk. Peace requires breathing room, and the melting world was shrinking that room day by day. The rise in tensions was not because humans became suddenly more aggressive. It was because the world narrowed around them, pushing them closer and closer until the thin membrane of caution between groups felt stretched to its limit. When climate, resources, and proximity all shifted at once, something deep inside the human mind recalibrated. The instinct to protect kin intensified, the willingness to retreat diminished, and the mental space for imagining strangers as potential allies began to shrink. This was the landscape in which the first organized acts of hostility began to take shape, not as a sudden leap into war, but as a gradual tightening of pressures, a slow heating of the waters until groups found themselves reacting in ways their ancestors had never needed to. Melted ice brought warmth, and warmth brought life, but it also brought tension that would soon spill into the earliest conflicts humans ever recorded in bone and memory. The rivers were becoming crowded with people, crowded with hopes, crowded with the subtle anxieties that grow when every shoreline hides an unfamiliar face. And as these waters filled, human minds filled too, carrying the weight of new social complexities our ancestors were unaccustomed to managing. The major waterways, northern melt-fed rivers, the Great Lakes of Africa, the overflowing marshes of the Levant, offered everything a group needed: fish, reeds, fertile soil, seasonal birds, drinking water, and reliable hunting paths. These resources became lifelines in a warming world, but they also became magnets, pulling different clans into the same narrowing spaces. If you could stand beside one of those ancient rivers at dawn, you might have seen smoke rising from several camps at once, each plume twisting into the morning air like a quiet but undeniable claim. We are here too. This closeness rewired how humans perceived one another. For countless generations, danger had come mostly from predators or the environment. Now, danger could appear in the form of a silhouette stepping across the river bend. This shift demanded constant vigilance. People began organizing sleeping arrangements differently, placing the most alert hunters near the camp edge, positioning fires so their glow revealed approaching figures, arranging shelters to face outward rather than inward. Subtle changes, but profound. These choices marked the beginning of thinking about other humans as the primary force worth guarding against. As overlapping territories increased, misunderstandings became frequent. Two groups might arrive at the same fishing shallows on the same morning, each believing they had reached it first. A child wandering too far from her camp might be spotted by members of another clan who interpreted her presence as a scouting attempt. A group might harvest reeds only to discover that another clan considered that area part of their seasonal basket-making grounds. None of these encounters on their own guaranteed violence, but each added another thread to a web of irritation, suspicion, and memory. Archaeological findings from this period reveal that settlements near rivers were often short-lived. People stayed just long enough to reap seasonal abundance, then moved suddenly, sometimes leaving behind personal objects normally carried with them: beads, partially carved tools, broken baskets. These abrupt departures suggest that something often forced them to leave before they intended, something more unpredictable than simple resource depletion. The pattern hints at encounters that turned tense, perhaps hostile, prompting groups to decide that safety lay not in claiming ground, but in walking away quickly. And yet leaving never solved the underlying problem. With rivers becoming the most dependable sources of stability, every retreat only led to new settlements along the same waterways farther downstream, places where other bands already lived or would soon arrive. Closeness repeated itself, following the current like a shadow. In this crowded environment, social behavior shifted in subtle but telling ways. Groups began to communicate more through distance signals, high-pitched calls to warn others of approach, patterned drumming on hollow logs, smoke signals crafted from specific materials to indicate intent. These early communication methods were not sophisticated yet, but they carried meaning: warnings, announcements of arrival, attempts to prevent surprise. The very creation of such signals suggests a shared fear of unexpected encounters. Crowded rivers also changed trade. Previously, exchanges happened rarely and carried great symbolic value: a shell traded for obsidian, a carved bone gifted in friendship. But with more frequent meetings, trade became less ceremonial and more strategic. A group struggling with poor quality stone might offer dried fish for hardened flint cores. Another band might exchange red ochre for finely crafted microliths. But trade, while beneficial, also revealed weaknesses. If a group traded too eagerly, others might sense desperation, an imbalance that could be exploited. Thus, trade itself became a form of silent negotiation, laden with risks. Food competition intensified as well. Fishing traps set by one clan often drifted into the territory of another, and whether those traps were returned, stolen, or destroyed became early tests of intergroup relations. Ambitious hunters sometimes followed herds across boundaries, tracing hoofprints into places where others camped. Every intrusion, intentional or accidental, added strain, especially when the difference between a full belly and a hungry night could depend on a single successful hunt. Communication between bands became more complex as groups developed small gestures, signs, or shared understandings to prevent immediate violence. A raised hand might signal peaceful intentions. Placing a bundle of reeds on the ground might indicate a wish to negotiate space. But shared languages rarely existed between separate clans, so even well-intended gestures could be misinterpreted. A step taken too quickly, a tool held at the wrong angle, a hunting spear resting in the hand instead of on the ground. Any of these could spark fear. Fear, in this era, was an accelerant. And because humans are storytellers, stories began to shape the landscape as much as the rivers themselves. Around nightly fires, people retold encounters with other clans, how one group refused to share a shoreline, how another seemed aggressive, how another carried unusually large weapons. These stories grew, shifted, and solidified into group beliefs, becoming part of how people understood the world. A single hostile meeting could become a cautionary tale repeated for years. That repetition built mental boundaries stronger than any physical line in the sand. Over time, these overlapping experiences forged something new, the sense that certain places belonged to certain people, even if the idea of ownership was still emerging. When groups returned to the same fishing spots year after year, familiarity created expectation. Expectation created attachment. Attachment created defensiveness, and defensiveness made conflict seem not only possible, but sometimes necessary. By the time the world had warmed enough for forests to thicken and wetlands to sprawl, humans around these crowded rivers were no longer just moving across landscapes. They were learning to contest them. Every shared current brought groups into closer contact, and every contact forced decisions about negotiation, avoidance, or confrontation. Minds became crowded with calculations, memories, warnings, and plans. This was the moment when the world began nudging humanity toward choices that would eventually crystallize into organized conflict. War had not begun yet, but the rivers, so full of life, were quietly carving the channels through which war would soon flow. Around 14,000 years ago, as human groups found themselves pressed together along the same rivers, in the same marshlands, under the same shrinking hunting routes, a new kind of thinking began to take root. It was subtle at first, almost instinctive, a shift from simply searching for food to weighing what would happen if someone else reached that food first. This was the beginning of the first scarcity calculations, the mental arithmetic that would eventually push humanity toward its earliest organized conflicts. For most of human prehistory, scarcity had been a matter of nature: harsh winters, migrating herds, failed harvests of wild grains. There were no enemies to blame, no rivals to imagine. But now, for the first time, scarcity had faces. Other humans, once distant strangers encountered rarely, became familiar presences along the horizon. Their fires flickered across the water at night, their footprints overlapped in mud, their tools washed up on riverbanks. These strangers were no longer abstract. They were close enough to make every resource feel slightly more fragile. The key shift was psychological. Humans began to recognize that another group could reduce their chances of survival, not through malice, but simply by existing in the same place at the same time. This realization created a new mental pressure: the need to predict others' intentions. Hunters scanned riverbanks not just for game, but for signs of rival activity. Foraging groups ventured out earlier, even before sunrise, to reach berry patches before anyone else. Parents watched the tree line anxiously, knowing that other bands might appear without warning. Each action grew more cautious, more calculated. Resources that once seemed abundant now felt contested. Seasonal salmon runs, for example, brought thousands of fish upstream in a matter of days. But the best nets, traps, and shallow pools only yielded plentiful catches if a group had time to set them. If another clan arrived first, the advantage was lost. Wild grain fields ripened under the sun, but harvesting them required hours of uninterrupted gathering. If another group approached, the harvest would be rushed, scattered, or abandoned. Even something as simple as drinking water at a bend of the river became a balancing act. Approach too late, and another group might already be there. Approach too early, and you risk meeting them head-on. Evidence from burial sites across this transitional era reveals changes in injury patterns consistent with rising tensions. We see more fractures in forearms, likely from defensive postures, and more stone points lodged in ribs or pelvises, injuries not associated with hunting accidents. These hints tell us that competition was growing sharper. But the true beginnings of organized conflict did not start with weapons. They started with these early risk assessments, the mental weighing of us versus them in terms of survival. One of the most significant scarcity calculations involved movement. Traditionally, hunter-gatherer bands followed seasonal rounds, moving predictably through known territories. But when the landscape changed and strangers began appearing along these routes, groups had to make decisions. Should they follow the same path despite the risk of confrontation? Should they take a longer, safer route? Should they stay put and hope the resources regenerated? Every choice carried danger, and every danger forced deeper thought. This constant balancing act created a new kind of social stress. Groups began sending scouts more frequently, skilled trackers who moved silently ahead of the main band, searching for signs of occupation. These scouts became crucial figures because their observations informed decisions that affected everyone's safety. A single misreading of footprints or campfire ash could lead a group into an avoidable conflict or into a place already emptied of resources. As scarcity sharpened, so did observation. People became experts at reading environmental clues: the angle of bent grass, the depth of footprints, the warmth of an abandoned hearth. They learned to identify the distinctive patterns in stone flakes left behind by different groups. Some flint napping styles were recognizable from miles away, and seeing these flakes near a water source could trigger immediate decisions to retreat or advance. The landscape became a canvas of information, and humans became analysts long before the word existed. But scarcity calculations did not always lead to avoidance. Sometimes they led to boldness. If a group believed that another clan was weak, injured, or distracted, they might push into territory they would otherwise avoid. If they saw fewer footprints than expected, they might assume a rival group had moved on and seize the opportunity. And if they smelled multiple fires across the marsh, the unmistakable sign of a large clan, they might decide to take risks elsewhere, even if those risks meant hunger. One particularly revealing pattern appears in ancient trash middens, piles of discarded bones, shells, and food waste. In earlier eras, these middens remained steady in size, indicating stable access to resources. But around 14,000 years ago, many middens become uneven, periods of plenty followed by periods of sudden scarcity. This tells us that groups were experiencing unpredictable access to food, likely due to increased competition. These fluctuations would have fueled even sharper calculations. If we share, will we starve? If we defend this place, will we survive the winter? If they take what we gathered, will our children go hungry? These fears were powerful motivators. Mothers watched resources diminish and worried. Elders, with decades of memory, warned that scarcity could mean death. Young hunters, driven by pride and responsibility, felt pressure to secure food by any means. Everyone contributed to the atmosphere that made conflict seem not desirable, but sometimes unavoidable. And when scarcity intensifies, trust becomes fragile. A group might allow another to forage nearby once, twice, maybe 3 times. But when stores ran low, generosity thinned. The mental ledger of favors, grievances, and perceived slights grew heavier. A poorly timed arrival from a neighboring band could transform suspicion into open hostility. And a single aggressive encounter, real or imagined, could ignite a cycle of defensive actions that spiraled beyond anyone's intentions. These early scarcity calculations were not war, but they were its scaffolding, the mental structures that allowed humans to justify organized violence long before they fully embraced it. The mind had begun shifting from survival through mobility to survival through defense, and from defense to preemptive action. The first conflict had not yet erupted, but its blueprint was already forming in the quiet thoughts of hunters watching the horizon, in the tense decisions of foragers choosing where to gather, and in the whispered conversations of families planning their next move. And with each new calculation, humanity stepped a little closer to its first true war. Long before humans built fortresses or forged bronze blades, they shaped something far more ancient, far more intimate, tools that fit the hand. And somewhere around 14,000 years ago, those tools, once designed purely for hunting and survival, began to change in ways that reveal a quiet, unsettling truth. The weapons that would one day define conflict did not appear suddenly. They evolved gradually, shaped by need, sharpened by fear, and repurposed by the growing pressures between neighboring groups. These were the weapons that changed intent, instruments that shifted from tools of the hunt to tools capable of sending a message across the widening gulf between clans. For tens of thousands of years, the atlatl, also called the spear thrower, was humanity's most elegant invention. It amplified the thrower's power, flinging darts farther and faster than any human arm could alone. But around the time tensions rose along crowded rivers and resource-rich marshes, the design of these darts changed subtly. The points became narrower, more symmetrical, and far more standardized. Hunters had always optimized their tools for specific prey, but now the modifications seemed tailored for different prey entirely. Prey that moved like humans, reacted like humans, and died like humans. Archaeologists studying sites from this era noticed patterns in microlith production. These tiny stone blades, only a few centimeters long, were once used mostly for composite hunting tools, embedded in wooden shafts or bone handles to form serrated edges. But suddenly, microliths began appearing in large uniform sets, shaped with remarkable precision. Many were triangular or trapezoidal, designed to penetrate deeply and break upon impact. That last detail is crucial. A blade that shattered inside a body was lethal to humans, but unnecessary for hunting animals, which typically required durable points for repeated use. These new microliths indicate shifting priorities, hunting tools remade with fighting in mind. Even bone weapons transformed. Prior to this period, bone points were often sturdy and thick, ideal for large game. But around the growing centers of human proximity, bone points became slimmer, lighter, faster to craft. A thinner point flies truer, breaks more easily, and can be mass-produced. It is a weapon meant not for one decisive kill, but for volleys, for sending multiple projectiles into the air with speed and rhythm. Evidence suggests some groups began making caches of these bone points, small stockpiles hidden near camps or along river trails, ready to be used quickly if conflict erupted. This behavior shows foresight, preparing not for hunting, but for confrontation. Bludgeoning tools changed as well. Clubs, once simple heavy branches selected opportunistically, became shaped intentionally. Some were smoothed for grip, others had weighted ends strengthened with rawhide wrappings. A few discovered specimens show grooves carved near the handle to prevent slipping during strikes. These refinements speak to practice, to repeated deliberate use in contexts where accuracy and control mattered more than brute force. Shields, too, make their first quiet appearance during this era, though they were not the rigid structures of later centuries. Instead, people began carrying large, flat pieces of bark or bundled reeds, bound tightly with sinew. Such makeshift shields offered little protection against an animal's charge, but were surprisingly effective at deflecting thrown darts or glancing blows. Their existence suggests that humans had begun preparing for encounters where defense against other humans was necessary. But perhaps the most telling transformation was not in the tools themselves, but in how they were carried. In earlier eras, hunters kept their spears close but relaxed, treating them as extensions of daily life. Now, groups began traveling with more weapons on hand, even during mundane tasks. Foragers carried additional blades tucked into waistbands. Night guards slept with atlatl darts within reach. Children learned to handle tools earlier, not just for practice, but because danger felt closer, more unpredictable. The simple act of carrying weapons more frequently reflects a cultural shift, a readiness for conflict even when conflict was not yet present. These developments did not happen uniformly. Some regions show dramatic changes in tools, others show subtle adjustments. But everywhere, the pattern aligns with the pressures of crowded landscapes and unpredictable interactions. In a world where groups met one another too often, where stories of aggression passed between fires at night, where scarcity hung like a shadow, tools inevitably adapted to new threats. The rise of specialized weaponry also changed social roles. Skilled toolmakers gained new status as their creations became crucial for defense. Young hunters learned not only to track animals, but to read the posture of approaching strangers, to judge when a hand near a weapon meant harmlessness or danger. Elders shared memories of past encounters, helping the next generation understand the difference between an approaching hunting party and a group scouting for territory. Knowledge became as important as strength. Weapon innovation also reshaped group identity. Distinct styles of microliths, spear points, and decorations became markers of belonging. A person could often identify which group someone came from simply by examining the hafting technique of their tools or the type of stone used in their darts. This visual identification had double effects. It encouraged pride within groups, but also suspicion between groups. A familiar style meant predictability. An unfamiliar one meant risk. And as weaponry advanced, the potential for violence increased. The atlatl, with its extended range, allowed conflict to begin from a distance. A dart thrown from across a marsh could strike before the attacker was even seen. A volley of microlith-tipped projectiles could disable multiple hunters before they reached cover. These capabilities emboldened some groups to act more aggressively, knowing they could retreat quickly after an attack. Others grew more cautious, organizing watches, setting up vantage points, learning the terrain more intimately to avoid ambush. Weapons were not merely evolving, they were altering behavior. They introduced new strategies, new fears, and new calculations. In earlier eras, two groups crossing paths might avoid each other instinctively. But now, with tools that could kill from far away, avoidance was harder. The very possibility of long-distance harm meant that groups interpreted movement differently. A person advancing with a spear no longer had to be close to pose a threat. A shadow on a ridge could be enough to spark panic. All these shifts were leading somewhere. They were building toward the moment when these tools, shaped by human hands, driven by human fears, would be used not as warnings or deterrents, but as instruments of deliberate, coordinated violence. Humanity had not yet taken that final step, but the tools were ready, intent was sharpening, fear was crystallizing into preparation. The spark that set the first true conflict alight was not a grand event, not a clash of armies or a deliberate campaign. It was something smaller, something heartbreakingly ordinary, born from misunderstanding, fear, and the unstable realities of a world where people lived too close for comfort. It happened at a marsh settlement that existed only for a single warm season, a place whose reeds whispered in the breeze and whose shallow pools promised fish, birds, and fresh water. This lakeside camp, quiet and unassuming, became the site where humanity first crossed the threshold from tension into organized violence. Picture the settlement in its early days. The marsh was soft underfoot, dotted with wildflowers and patches of trapped sunlight. Families built their shelters on slightly raised ground above the waterline, weaving reed walls and covering them with hides. Smoke curled from cooking fires, and children played at the edge of the pools, chasing small frogs. Hunters returned at dusk with birds caught in snares and fish strung over their shoulders. It was a place of temporary peace, of seasonal prosperity. But prosperity in those days was fragile, and so was peace. This marsh lay at the intersection of three migratory routes: the path of gazelle herds, the flight line of waterfowl, and the winding trails of humans seeking dependable food. For years, the marsh may have been used by one group at a time, each clan leaving its imprint, charcoal, footprints, discarded shells, before moving on. But around 14,000 years ago, something changed. Two groups arrived at the marsh within days of each other, both drawn by the abundance of spring rains and the promise of shelter. One camp settled at the northern edge among tall reeds. The other camp, unknowingly, established itself on a southern rise. At first, neither group realized the other was there. The marsh's expanse, with its twisting channels and thick vegetation, concealed their presence, but soon enough, signs emerged. The northern group found footprints that did not match their own. The southern group discovered a fresh fish trap already staked into a channel they had planned to use. Smoke drifted across the water at unusual angles. These clues created a growing tension, a silent question that lingered in every breath. Who else is here, and what do they want? What? The first encounter was cautious but not hostile. Hunters from both camps saw one another across the open water, each group pausing mid-step. They lifted their hands in a gesture meant to signal neutrality. No words were exchanged. Their languages differed, but the message was clear. We see you. We are not attacking. Yet. The moment passed without violence, and both groups returned to their camps, uneasy but hopeful that coexistence was possible, at least for the season. But coexistence requires predictability, and predictability was impossible in a world strained by scarcity. As days passed, competition deepened. The best fishing pools were limited. The prime reed patches for weaving were dwindling. The northern group believed they had arrived first, and therefore had priority over the land. The southern group believed the marsh was unclaimed and therefore open for equal use. Without shared language or established customs, neither group could resolve these conflicting assumptions. Small incidents began accumulating, each one insignificant alone, but dangerous when woven together. A young boy from the southern camp accidentally wandered too near the northern camp's drying racks, startling an elder who interpreted his presence as scouting. A northern hunter found one of their woven baskets displaced, tracks suggesting someone had picked it up, examined it, then set it down. A southern woman noticed fresh footprints around her canoe, the pattern of steps unfamiliar. None of these events involved violence, but each planted a seed of mistrust. The moment that became the spark happened during a morning mist thick enough to blur shapes. A northern hunter named Aruk, broad-shouldered, patient, accustomed to reading the marsh like a map, was checking his fish traps when he noticed movement. Through the fog, he saw what he believed was an animal caught in reeds. He crept closer, atlatl dart ready but lowered, expecting to free a trapped bird or retrieve a struggling fish. But as he approached, the shape shifted unexpectedly. A person, not an animal. A young southern gatherer named Lala was crouched near the water, cutting reeds. She heard Aruk's approach but assumed it was someone from her own camp. When she stood suddenly to greet the figure, Aruk startled, believing she had risen with aggressive intent. His dart hand twitched. Lala, seeing the weapon, panicked and stepped back, raising her arm in instinctive defense. The moment stretched thin as a reed stalk. Then, in a tragic flash of fear, Aruk released his dart, not deliberately, not with malice, but with the reflex of someone who sensed danger too close, too sudden. The dart struck Lala in the thigh, embedding deeply. She screamed, collapsing into the shallow water. Aruk froze, horrified, understanding too late what had happened. He moved toward her, hands open in remorse, but distant shouts erupted across the marsh. Members of Lala's group had heard her cry and were running toward the sound. The moment Aruk stepped back, they saw him as the aggressor. In their eyes, a stranger had attacked one of their own. Fear, once awakened, spreads with terrifying speed. The southern group rushed toward Lala, dragging her onto the bank and seeing the dart, stone point, wooden shaft, unmistakably crafted by the northern camp. They interpreted it not as a mistake, but as a message. Stay away. This marsh is ours. Their anger rose as fast as their alarm. Meanwhile, Aruk sprinted back to his camp, breathless, shouting for help, explaining what had happened in broken fragments. His group believed him, but belief could not stop what was coming. Within hours, scouts from both camps observed each other moving differently. Spears were carried upright, not resting. Fires were stoked more brightly, signals of vigilance. Children were moved to the center of camp. Night watches doubled. Fear thickened the air. The marsh, once peaceful, now felt like a container too small to hold the rapidly expanding tension. The next morning, a southern delegation approached the northern camp carrying Lala's bloodied dart, intending to demand explanation or reparation. But the groups did not share a common system for negotiation. The northern camp interpreted the approach as a challenge. The southern camp interpreted the northern camp's raised weapons as defiance. When a northern youth stepped forward nervously with a spear, a southern hunter assumed it was preparation for attack and hurled his own. That spear missed, but the gesture shattered any chance of peace. The first clash began not with strategy, not with ambition, but with fear. A volley of darts flew across the marsh's edge, both sides shouting, neither hearing the other clearly. People retreated and regrouped. Hunters flanked through the reeds. A child cried. An elder staggered. A woman shielded her infant as arrows hissed overhead. In less than an hour, the first organized human conflict had begun. Chaotic, tragic, shaped entirely by misunderstanding and the pressures of proximity. When the marsh erupted into that first chaotic clash, something irreversible stirred inside the human story, an awakening of roles that had existed only in faint embryonic form. Until then, groups had moved fluidly, with leadership based on experience, generosity, or simple necessity. But conflict hardens fluidity into structure. It demands coordinators, decision-makers, voices that can cut through fear and create direction where panic threatens to scatter everyone. And so, in the tense days that followed the marsh spark, humanity witnessed the quiet birth of leaders, followers, and the earliest outlines of collective roles, shaped not only by survival, but by the new and frightening reality of organized violence. The northern and southern camps, shaken by the initial exchange of projectiles, huddled separately to make sense of what had happened. People were frightened, children clung to their parents, elders whispered warnings, hunters sharpened tools with trembling hands. In both camps, the air was thick with uncertainty about whether the other group would attack again, whether more violence was coming, and what the path forward should be. In such moments, individuals naturally look to those who appear calm, decisive, or experienced. And in this crucible of fear, proto-commanders emerged. In the northern camp, that figure was Aruk, not because he had thrown the first dart, but because he was the only one who had seen the event unfold moment by moment. His account shaped the group's understanding. People turned to him for details. How many were in the southern group? Did they seem eager for battle or terrified? What weapons did they carry? Aruk, despite his guilt, answered steadily. He explained that the encounter had been a misunderstanding, that Lala was wounded but not deliberately targeted. But his voice, though clear, carried echoes of regret and fear, emotions that others perceived as honesty. And honesty, in a moment of crisis, became a form of leadership. In the southern camp, the emerging leader was not one of the hunters, but an older woman named Terama. She had long been respected for her knowledge of healing, ritual, and the landscape. When Lala was brought back bleeding and shaking, Terama tended to her wound with steady hands. She listened to the frantic accounts from those who had witnessed the confrontation and then spoke with a clarity that quieted the camp's panic. She reminded them that fear clouds judgment, that rash decisions lead to tragedy, and that the marsh, despite the danger, still held the resources they desperately needed. Her calm authority steadied them, and soon, unconsciously, the group deferred to her guidance. These two figures, Aruk and Terama, represented two forms of emerging leadership, the situational leader who rose because of proximity to a key event, and the enduring leader who wielded influence through wisdom and trust. Neither was a chieftain in the later sense of the word. But in both camps, decisions began to flow through them, marking one of the earliest moments when human groups used centralized voices to navigate collective threat. With leadership came roles. Hunters became protectors, sent to patrol the marsh's edges and watch for movement across the reeds. Gatherers adjusted their routines, moving in pairs or trios instead of alone. Young adolescents took on tasks of carrying water, weaving new carrying slings, preparing extra darts, work they had performed before, but now with a new urgency, aware that these tasks supported something larger than their families. Even children sensed the shift, playing less loudly, staying closer to home, watching adults with wide, silent eyes. Roles emerged because conflict requires coordination, and coordination requires trust in those who guide. In the northern camp, Aruk organized night watches, assigning the most alert hunters to rotate around the camp's perimeter. He examined their stockpile of darts and realized how few remained after the initial volley. A group of toolmakers and young apprentices began producing more, working late into the night, heating pitch over the fire to attach stone points. He sent 2 scouts, swift-footed, quiet, into the tall grass to observe the southern camp from a distance, not to provoke, but to gather information. Information, now more than ever, was survival. In the southern camp, Terama created a different kind of structure. She instructed several adults to weave large reed mats to serve as makeshift shields. She organized the women into small gathering parties, instructing them which areas were safe and which ones to avoid. She taught the younger hunters how to carry their spears low, not high, to reduce the chance of appearing aggressive when moving near the water. And she tended to Lale, whose wound throbbed with infection risk. Keeping her alive was vital, not only because every life mattered, but because her survival shaped how the group interpreted the event. If she lived, peace might still seem possible. If she died, hostility would deepen. What's striking about this moment in human history is how quickly these roles solidified. Groups that had operated loosely for tens of thousands of years found themselves behaving with new precision. Conflict created urgency, and urgency created structure. It was one of the first times humans coordinated actions toward a shared external threat, a behavior that would eventually define warfare. Leadership also revealed itself through storytelling. On the second night after the initial clash, as both camps sat around their fires, leaders shaped the narrative for their people. In the northern camp, Aruk emphasized that the southern group seemed frightened, not bloodthirsty, and that a cautious approach might de-escalate the situation. In the southern camp, Terama urged restraint, reminding her people that acting from fear often led to disaster. She spoke of ancestors who survived hardships by choosing patience over aggression. Her words soothed, but they also prepared the group for defense if needed. These stories, told by firelight, were more than explanations. They were tools of cohesion. They bound groups together under shared purpose, aligning individual actions toward collective goals. This was the earliest form of strategic communication, and in both camps, people listened closely, because uncertainty made every word carry weight. The emergence of leadership reshaped social relationships. Some individuals who had previously carried little influence now found themselves essential due to their skills. Sharp-eyed trackers, calm-handed healers, fast runners capable of relaying messages. Others who once held social weight lost prominence if their advice faltered under pressure. Conflict was an equalizer and a shaper. It elevated some, humbled others, and forced everyone to engage with the group at a deeper, more coordinated level. Perhaps the most significant shift was the birth of responsibility beyond the family level. Hunters did not guard only their own children, they guarded everyone's. Toolmakers did not craft weapons only for themselves, they produced for the group. Healers did not treat only relatives, they tended to all who were wounded. This expanding sense of duty formed the earliest bonds of collective identity, an understanding that one's survival was intertwined with the survival of the group, and that leadership existed to protect that collective whole. By the time the fourth day dawned after the first clash, the marsh was transformed. The reeds still waved gently in the breeze, the water still reflected morning light, the birds still skimmed the surface. But beneath that natural calm, two human groups were restructuring themselves, becoming more coordinated, more watchful, more prepared. Leaders had emerged, followers had accepted roles, and the shape of something new, something that would ripple across all future generations, had begun to form. The marsh settlement had become more than a temporary camp. It had become a crucible where humanity learned for the first time how to organize not just for survival, but for conflict. In the days following the first clash at the marsh, fear became the shared currency of both camps, exchanged in glances, in murmured conversations, in the way people held their tools a little tighter and looked at the horizon a little longer. It bound them together internally, even as it widened the distance between them and the strangers across the reeds. Fear itself was not new to humanity. Our ancestors had carried it through encounters with predators, storms, and long winters. But fear of other humans, consistent, collective, and inescapably close, was something different. It pooled inside each group, accumulating faster than understanding could contain it. And as it pooled, it began to shape behavior, culture, and even identity, becoming one of the earliest forces that taught humans to see themselves not only as individuals or families, but as members of a group defined by shared threat. In the northern camp, fear manifested in vigilance. Nights grew louder with the rustle of shifting bodies as people woke repeatedly, listening for distant footsteps or the splash of someone crossing the marsh. The sound of a water bird taking flight could startle a whole cluster of sleepers into sitting upright, hearts pounding. In the southern camp, fear took the form of suspicion. Every distant shadow became a potential scout. Every snapped reed echoed like a deliberate step. Even harmless animal tracks were examined closely in case a rival had passed through while the group slept. Children sensed the tension most acutely. They watched adults whisper in tight circles. They noticed when laughter faded from the camp. Some pressed close to their mothers, reluctant to wander even a few meters from the shelters. Others tried to be brave, mimicking the stiff posture of hunters or the steady movements of elders, learning, far earlier than generations before them, that survival sometimes depended on silence, watchfulness, and restraint. Fear also reshaped how groups interpreted stories. The initial encounter between Arik and Lala, retold around both campfires, changed subtly each time someone spoke of it. Not because anyone intended to distort the truth, but because fear magnifies certain details and diminishes others. In the northern camp, some emphasized Lala's sudden movement. In the southern camp, some emphasized Arik's weapon being raised. These differing interpretations hardened into belief, strengthening internal unity even as they deepened the divide between the camps. Humans, even then, were storytellers, and fear sharpened the power of these stories. Around the southern fire, a young hunter recalled seeing a northern scout near the tree line 2 days before the clash, a sighting he had ignored at the time. Now, retold in the glow of unease, it became evidence of northern aggression. In the northern camp, an elder spoke of past years when strangers took more than they needed from shared marshes in other regions. It did not matter that these stories were distant. Fear pulled them into the present. Fear changed rituals, too. In both camps, people began applying ochre, red, yellow, white, not only as personal decoration, but as symbols of protection. In the northern camp, hunters smeared lines of white clay under their eyes before night watch, believing it allowed spirits to shield them. In the southern camp, Women marked the entrances of their shelters with circles of red ochre, hoping ancestors would keep danger at bay. These acts were gestures of comfort, but they also served another function. They reinforced group identity. The more distinct each camp looked, the more clearly members could see themselves as us, separate from them. Fear also transformed the marsh itself. Paths that had once been walked casually were now scouted. The shallow pools where children played grew silent. Fishing spots were approached cautiously, with one person watching the reeds while another checked traps. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, taking flight earlier, circling warily above the water. No part of daily life was untouched by the tension, and yet, fear did something else, something paradoxical. It strengthened internal cooperation. People helped one another more readily, knowing that a united group stood a better chance of surviving whatever might come. Tasks were shared more evenly. Hunters discussed strategies more openly. Mothers assisted each other with gathering. Elders shared memories of past dangers. In both camps, a sense of collective resilience grew, as if fear had woven invisible threads between each person, binding them into something larger than themselves. This was one of the earliest moments in history when fear created group identity. Not the identity of clans built on lineage or tradition, but identity built on shared threat. Anthropologists see signs of this in archaeological patterns: sudden increases in uniform tool styles within regions, consistent decoration methods, and coordinated site layouts. These changes suggest that groups were becoming more internally unified, more organized, more aligned around common defense. Yet fear carried a cost. It narrowed perception. It made peaceful gestures harder to interpret. When a northern scout left a deer bone near the southern boundary, perhaps as a sign of remorse or goodwill, the southern group interpreted it as a territorial warning. When southern foragers approached the water with empty hands raised, the northern hunters saw it as a tactic to distract them, while others circled behind. Fear interprets ambiguity in the least charitable way. As both camps strengthened their roles and tightened their defenses, fear became self-reinforcing. The more each group prepared for conflict, the more the other saw that preparation as aggression. A simple action, moving a canoe, gathering extra reeds, sharpening a stack of darts, could be interpreted as preparation for attack. Every harmless choice became suspect. Fear, in this way, became the architect of behavior. It dictated patterns of movement. It governed the layout of shelters. It shaped the order of daily tasks. It sharpened weapons, tightened guards, and shortened tempers. And as fear deepened, one chilling truth became clear. Once a group believes another group might attack, preparations for defense often resemble preparations for offense. This overlap is what drives conflict forward. By the end of the second week at the marsh, neither group had attacked again, yet both had become more ready than ever to do so. They had new leaders, they had new roles, they had new stories reinforcing caution. Fear had reshaped everything. And in the silence between reed beds, where water reflected the sky with perfect calm, the next stage of human conflict was preparing to emerge, not from hostility, not from cruelty, but from the protective instinct of groups who felt they could no longer rely on chance or hope alone. Fear had become their shared currency, and it was about to purchase something irreversible. And so, in the tall grass surrounding the wetlands, early humans discovered a truth that would echo across the ages. Survival was not only strengthened by unity within a single camp, but by finding allies among strangers who shared the same dangers. This was not yet diplomacy in the way later civilizations would practice it. There were no formal negotiations, no treaties, no envoys with decorated cloaks. Alliances began simply, almost tentatively, born from observation, mutual need, and the unspoken recognition that a lone group, however skilled, could not endure prolonged conflict without friends. And it was in this delicate moment of human uncertainty, when the marsh settlement teetered between violence and endurance, that alliances in the tall grass began forming. Unknown to both the northern and southern camps, a third group had been observing events from a distance. Called the Riverbend people by archaeologists today, identified by their distinctive napped flints found miles away, they had traveled through this region before, usually avoiding the marsh because of its seasonal flooding. But the warming world had changed their patterns too. As their own food routes shifted, they began passing closer to the settlement, noticing the unusual signs: scattered reeds lying unnaturally flat, multiple campsites hidden in different pockets of the marsh, and most telling of all, the sharp, unexpected echo of atlatl darts striking wooden shields. For seasoned travelers like the Riverbend group, these signs meant one thing: conflict was near. Yet instead of withdrawing, their leader, a middle-aged tracker named Senan, chose to stay hidden in the tall grass and gather more information. Senan was a thoughtful man, known for reading the land with uncanny precision. His group respected him not because he was physically strong, but because he understood patterns. And the pattern he saw now was new, concerning, and possibly dangerous to anyone nearby. His scouts returned with detailed observations. 2 camps, not one, both preparing defenses, both tents, both armed. Sinan realized something unusual was happening. For as long as he could remember, small conflicts between families or individuals had flared and cooled quickly, like sparks from a fire. But this, 2 organized camps preparing for possible prolonged confrontation, felt different. It felt larger, more deliberate, more likely to spread. So Senan made a decision that would become one of the earliest examples of alliance building in human history. He led his group in a wide circle around the marsh and approached the southern camp deliberately, openly, slowly, making sure they were seen long before they arrived. His hope was simple: to understand what was happening, and if possible, to prevent the conflict from escalating into something that could endanger everyone in the region. The southern camp reacted with alarm at first. They tightened their ranks, raised weapons, and shielded their children behind the shelters. But when it became clear that the newcomers were moving with caution, making no aggressive gestures, Tarama stepped forward to meet them. She recognized immediately that these were not the northern hunters. Their clothing was different, their hair worn in distinctive braids, their tools shaped with a craftsmanship her group had never seen. From the first hesitant gestures between Tarama and Sinan's group, something remarkable emerged: the beginnings of cooperative language. They exchanged objects, neutral, useful, non-threatening things like smooth stones, woven grass cords, and dried berries. These offerings were not gifts of wealth, but signals of intent. We are not here to harm you. We are here to understand. Through gestures, shared food, and patient observation, the southern camp informed Sinan's group of the tension with the northern camp, pointing toward the distant reeds and mimicking the stance of a spear thrown in fear. Senan listened. He examined Lala's wound, tracing the shape of the stone point embedded in her flesh. The northern style was unmistakable. He did not know Aruk's group personally, but he had encountered hunters from similar bands in seasons past, quiet people, often cautious but rarely aggressive without reason. What he saw now troubled him deeply. Fear had transformed caution into hostility, and hostility could, if left unchecked, become war. He shared his concerns with Tarama, and though their words were not fully understood by the other, their intentions were clear enough. Senan offered help, support in gathering food, providing additional scouts, teaching defensive formations that avoided escalation. Tarama accepted cautiously, knowing her group needed allies if conflict returned. And just like that, an informal alliance formed, not through a verbal agreement, but through mutual recognition of shared risk. News traveled differently back then, slowly, carried through movement and memory rather than speech. Yet alliances spread faster than enmity. Within a few days, rumors reached the northern camp that a new group had entered the marsh, and Aruk's people debated how to respond. Some feared this was a reinforcement for the southern camp. Others believed the newcomers might mediate. Their uncertainty heightened tension, but also forced them to rethink their defensive posture. If more people were entering the marsh, isolation was no longer viable. Meanwhile, Senan's group proved invaluable to the southern camp. They taught them how to move silently through the tall grass, how to observe without being seen, how to interpret distant sounds on the water. The southern hunters learned to predict northern movement more accurately, not to ambush, but to avoid unnecessary confrontation. And Tarama, in turn, shared her knowledge of medicinal plants, easing the pain of Sinan's elders. In this shared space, a new social pattern emerged, groups forming brief but meaningful alliances based on overlapping needs. Archaeologists later identified evidence of such cooperation in the form of mixed tool styles at certain sites, suggesting that people with different cultural backgrounds collaborated, even if temporarily. The Marsh Alliance was likely one of the earliest instances of this phenomenon. But alliances also changed expectations. With support from Senan's group, the southern camp grew more confident, less fearful of northern aggression. Confidence, however, can be misread. When a group feels supported, their behavior shifts. They stand taller, move more boldly, guard their space more assertively. And in the northern camp, these changes were misinterpreted as preparation for escalation. Meanwhile, Senan attempted something unprecedented. He approached the northern camp in the same cautious, respectful way he had approached the southern one. But this time, fear overwhelmed perception. Uruk's scouts saw the newcomers and panicked, assuming they were reinforcements for the southern camp. They retreated too quickly, and their panic spread to the rest of the camp before Senan could even reach them. The chance for a three-way dialogue dissolved before it ever truly began. Yet, even in failure, Senan's attempt marks a turning point. His presence shaped the southern camp's strategy, and his observations influenced the northern camp's fear. This was the first recorded moment where a neutral third party tried to intervene in human conflict, a primitive ancestor to the mediators, diplomats, and peacekeepers of future ages. The alliances that formed in the tall grass did not stop conflict. They did not prevent the next clash. But they did something equally important. They taught humans that cooperation beyond kinship was possible, that groups could align interests not only for hunting or trade, but for navigating the threat of violence. This realization, fragile, imperfect, but profound, marked a new chapter in humanity's story. War was coming, but so was something else. The understanding that humans were not destined to fight alone. People began counting the cost of violence, not in numbers, not in tallied losses, not in an abstract sense of victory or defeat, but in the deeply personal, deeply human ways that conflict marks the body, the spirit, and the fragile balance of a community struggling to survive. The first conflict had barely begun, yet already its shadow stretched across every life touched by the tension between the northern and southern camps. The first to bear this cost, quietly and painfully, was Lala. Her wound, deep, swollen, throbbing with infection, became a living reminder of the fragile line between misunderstanding and tragedy. She lay inside the southern shelter that Tarama had prepared specially for her, the air thick with the scent of crushed herbs meant to keep away fever spirits. The microlith embedded in her thigh was crafted too deeply to remove without risking further damage. The southern group could do little more than clean the wound, pack it with poultices, and hope her body would heal. Lala's suffering rippled through her camp. Children who once laughed now whispered, stealing glances at her pale face. Her mother sat beside her every day, rarely speaking, fear etched into her eyes. Hunters returning from foraging trips paused at the shelter's entrance, their expressions tightening as they saw the dart's fletching still protruding from her thigh. Her pain became the emotional weight of the entire group. This was the first moment they fully understood. Conflict was not just risk, it was consequence. In the northern camp, Uruk carried the weight differently. He did not eat much, he spoke little. At night he lay awake, staring at the dim glow of embers, the image of Lale collapsing into the water replaying in his mind again and again. His people reassured him, telling him the encounter was an accident, that anyone in his position would have reacted the same. But guilt is stubborn. It clings to memory, reshapes identity, and forces a person to reckon with actions they never intended. Uruk's internal turmoil became the northern camp's moral anchor. While others sharpened weapons, he urged restraint. While some argued for striking preemptively, he insisted they wait. His concern was not only strategic, it was emotional. He had felt firsthand the cost of misunderstanding, and he did not want his group to become the cause of further suffering. As tension lingered, both camps experienced new, unforeseen burdens. The daily tasks of survival grew heavier under the psychological weight of potential conflict. Foragers returned more quickly, gathering less food because the marsh felt dangerous. Hunters wasted precious energy scanning the horizon rather than focusing on tracking prey. Sleeping patterns fractured, people awoke repeatedly, listening for distant sounds. Every breath felt doubled by the constant need to stay alert. Even simple injuries, once routine, became sources of anxiety. A cut finger or twisted ankle could incapacitate someone at the very moment when the group might need every able body. A fever could sweep through the shelters if people remained huddled together for too long. The camps began rationing food not because resources were scarce, but because they feared keeping large stores might attract attention or provoke thieves. This was another cost of violence, the erosion of normal life, the shrinking of daily comfort. Archaeological evidence from similar periods shows that stress markers, lines etched into bones and teeth, became more common during this transitional era. These markers reflect malnutrition, sleeplessness, and chronic anxiety. Even though the marsh conflict was small by later standards, it was enough to change physiology. Conflict, even in its earliest forms, etched itself into the human body, but the cost of violence extended beyond physical harm. It touched relationships. In both camps, whispers began circulating: blame, doubt, fear, worry. The northern elders debated whether Arak's guilt clouded his judgment. The southern youths argued whether they should retaliate, believing their group was losing face by showing restraint. These whispers strained the fabric of unity that leaders had tried so hard to preserve. And yet, in this strain, something vital emerged: the need for care. Care had always existed, parents caring for children, healers caring for the sick, but now care expanded into something collective, structured, intentional. Lala became the first war casualty in the southern camp, and her treatment became their first organized act of group-level compassion before conflict had fully broken out. People took turns tending her, gathering herbs, fetching water, singing soft, reassuring melodies that they hoped would calm both her and themselves. In the northern camp, a young hunter sprained his ankle while rushing to scout the southern perimeter. In peaceful times, he would have simply rested. But now the camp needed every alert pair of eyes, so they built him a splint, created a walking stick, and assigned others to cover his watch shifts. Helping him became an act of strategy as much as compassion. Through these acts, early humans learned that conflict required new forms of care that supported not just individuals, but the group's ability to endure. The psychological cost spread further. Parents taught their children new rules: stay close, do not wander, keep your voice low near the water. These rules, born from fear, began shaping childhood itself. For the first time, innocence required safeguarding from other humans, not just the dangers of nature. This shift left deep emotional imprints on the next generation, teaching them that vigilance was not temporary, it was a way of life. Meanwhile, both camps began creating small rituals meant to ease collective anxiety. In the southern camp, members gathered each evening around a central fire where Tarama sprinkled aromatic herbs into the flames. The rising smoke was believed to soothe fear spirits, warding off misfortune. Whether or not it worked, the ritual calmed people. It gave them a shared moment of stillness, a reminder that even in danger, community remained. In the northern camp, the elders revived an old practice of singing low, rhythmic songs before sleep, melodies meant to steady the heart and remind people of their shared lineage. These songs echoed softly across the marsh at night, drifting over the reeds. Some southern members heard them and were startled. Others, surprisingly, found the melodies comforting. A few even wondered, quietly, privately, whether the groups were truly meant to be enemies. But fear lingered. And so did the cost. As injuries accumulated, as sleep grew thin, as food stores fluctuated, the camps realized that conflict consumed far more energy than they had imagined. It demanded constant preparation. It demanded emotional resilience. It demanded cooperation within the group at levels they had never practiced before. Every day they lived in readiness for violence. They paid a heavy price in time, energy, health, and hope. And yet, the cost of not preparing felt even greater. This paradox, prepare to avoid harm, but preparation itself creates harm, became the unspoken truth shaping the marsh. Humans were learning the cruel economics of conflict, where every choice carried risk and every risk carried weight. The stage was set for the next evolution in human behavior, not just defending territory, not just reacting to fear, but deliberately marking space and identity to prevent misunderstandings from spiraling into violence. The cost of violence had been counted. Now the question became how to limit it. For the first time, humans began marking territory deliberately, not through instinctual behaviors like animals, not through fleeting signs of temporary occupation, but through intentional boundaries, territory lines in the dust that expressed something profoundly new. This place is ours, and crossing it carries meaning. These early boundaries were not fences, of course. They were not walls or fortifications. They were gestures made visible in the land, a stack of stones, a circle of burnt reeds, a line of shells arranged carefully near a water's edge, marks that whispered rather than shouted, that did not prevent crossing, but warned that crossing came with consequences. In earlier ages, humans roamed widely and intermittently, stopping only long enough to gather, hunt, or rest. But now, for the first time, groups were lingering long enough and worrying long enough to want to signal ownership. It began subtly, almost by accident. In the southern camp, after the initial clash and the formation of their alliance with Sinan's Riverbend group, Tarama instructed a few members to clear a stretch of ground just beyond their shelters. They removed stones, trampled reeds, swept away debris. The intention was practical, to create a clean area near the shelters where children could move freely without stepping on thorns. But the effect was symbolic. When Northern scouts passed through days later, they interpreted the cleared space as an intentional claim. This land has been shaped by human hands, the smooth ground seemed to say. Someone considers it theirs. In the northern camp, a similar but more explicit gesture emerged. Aruk, pressured by his hunters to clarify their position, encouraged small piles of stones to be placed at intervals along a ridge overlooking the water. These stones, identical in size and shape, repeated at regular distances, told a silent story. Do not pass this line. Not everyone in the northern camp agreed with the idea. Some feared it would provoke rather than prevent conflict. But the stones went up anyway, because people needed something tangible, something that felt like control in a world where uncertainty was the only constant. This was the dawn of territorial thinking, and its emergence marked a turning point. Humans had always understood space, always moved through environments with sensitivity and memory, but this was the first time groups tried to define space as an extension of themselves. The marsh became a contested map, etched not in ink or parchment but in the arrangement of nature itself. Stones, reeds, fire pits, paths cleared through grass. Archaeologists today see hints of this behavior during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Patterns of hearth placement shift from random clusters to more structured arrangements. Waste piles, middens, appear in designated spots instead of scattered. Trails between water, shelter, and work areas become more defined. These marks suggest not only routine but ownership. When people begin leaving consistent patterns in the landscape, it means they expect to return. When they expect to return, they begin to defend. The marsh became a strange patchwork of intentions. The southern group tied reeds into braided loops and hung them from low branches. To them, the loops symbolized unity, meant to protect their camp spiritually. But to the northern scouts who spotted them, the loops looked like boundary markers, warnings, or territorial claims. Misinterpretation layered onto misinterpretation. Meanwhile, the Riverbend group, ever observant, marked their temporary shelters with small pits of white ash, a signature of their presence used across the region. These ash markers were not meant as territorial stakes, but as identifiers, like signatures in the earth that told other travelers, this place was used respectfully. You may also rest here. But in the volatile atmosphere of the marsh, even these neutral gestures took on new meaning. The northern camp, seeing multiple ash pits near a southern activity area, interpreted them as reinforcements, physical evidence that the southern group was expanding rather than retreating. As misunderstandings compounded, territorial thinking intensified. Groups began moving differently. Hunters avoided certain routes, not because they lacked game, but because they lay too close to boundary areas. Gatherers collected reeds only from specific stretches of marsh, leaving untouched zones between them and their rivals. Even water was drawn from designated parts of the shoreline, as if invisible lines extended across the wet ground, separating ours from theirs. This new spatial behavior had psychological effects. People began forming mental maps not just of the marsh, but of the risk zones within it. Northern children were told not to play past the ridgestones. Southern mothers warned their children not to cross beyond the braided reeds. These boundaries, though invisible to an outsider, became deeply real to those living within them. They defined safety and danger, belonging and trespass. One of the most revealing signs of shifting territorial behavior occurred during a gathering expedition by the southern camp. Tarama sent 3 women and 2 young men to collect edible bulbs in a fertile patch, a short walk from the shelters. When they arrived, they discovered that the northern group had swept the ground nearby, leaving behind a large pile of peeled bark and broken reeds, clear signs of recent activity. The southern gatherers hesitated. In earlier years, such signs would simply indicate that another group had been through the area. Nothing more. But now, with boundary markers fresh in everyone's mind, these signs felt like a declaration. This area was ours today. Approach with caution. They retreated with less food than they had hoped to gather. And that retreat, small and silent though it was, represented something enormous, a shift from shared landscape to claimed landscape, from fluid movement to structured boundaries. Humans were learning that territorial decisions came with consequences: hunger, risk, fear, hesitation, and sometimes retaliation. In the northern camp, elders debated the meaning of their own stone markers. Some believed they should be temporary, removed when the marsh season ended. Others argued they should be made more permanent, teaching outsiders to respect their boundaries. Younger hunters, emboldened by responsibility and adrenaline, argued that the markers needed enforcement, that unchallenged crossings would invite disrespect. Territory, once marked, demands defense. And so the marsh braced itself for the next phase of human conflict, not a spontaneous clash sparked by fear or mistake, but a deliberate confrontation shaped by lines drawn in dust, in reeds, in stone. A confrontation born not of misunderstanding alone, but of encroachment. Territorial thinking had taken hold. It changed expectations, it changed behavior, it changed the meaning of movement itself. For the first time in human history, land was becoming more than a resource. It was becoming an identity. And identity, once grounded in place, reshapes everything that follows. Humans had always mourned their dead in their own ways, but now, under the weight of tension and the threat of violent confrontation, memory itself became a tool of survival. In this fragile age, the memory of the fallen, not just those who died, but those who suffered, those who were wounded, those who were nearly lost, began guiding decisions, shaping identity, and grounding early humans in something deeper than fear: meaning. It began with Lala. The young southern gatherer became the first living symbol of the conflict, her wound a silent story etched into flesh. Her survival was uncertain, her fever rising and falling like the tide. Each time she cried out in pain, the camp listened, hearts tightening. People who barely knew her brought water, herbs, and woven blankets. Elders whispered protective songs. Children peeked from the shelter entrance, watching the stillness settle over her as she drifted between consciousness and delirium. Her suffering was no longer only her own. It belonged to the entire camp. Tarama, tending endlessly to Lale, realized something essential. The wound had changed the group. People spoke differently now. They gathered closer around the fire at night. They handled their tools with more intention. They whispered about the marsh with new reverence, as if the reeds themselves could reveal secrets about how to keep one another safe. Layla's injury, painful and tragic, had become a focal point, a reminder of how fragile life was and how conflict magnified that fragility tenfold. In the northern camp, Aru carried his own burden of memory. Though no one in his group had died, the weight of causing harm, even unintentionally, shaped every moment of his waking life. Each time he looked toward the south, he saw not strangers, but the image of Lala collapsing into the water. That memory softened him, but it also hardened his resolve to prevent further bloodshed. His guilt became something larger, a lesson, a warning, a quiet push toward restraint. In sharing his story with others, he created a collective memory for the northern camp, a memory that reminded them to tread carefully, think slowly, and avoid unnecessary harm. Memory, of course, had always existed in human communities, but now it began to take on a new, structured form. The marsh conflict taught humans something that would echo across millennia, that remembering the fallen, whether through words, objects, or quiet ritual, was a way to stabilize the chaos of violence. In the southern camp, this new remembrance manifested in the form of a small circle of stones placed near Lala's shelter. Tarama instructed children to place a pebble there each day, a gesture meant to call upon ancestral spirits for healing. Whether or not the spirits answered, the ritual grounded the group emotionally. It turned Lala's suffering into a shared vigil rather than an isolated tragedy. It gave meaning to watchfulness, patience, and hope. Even the Riverbend group contributed to this emerging culture of memory. Sinan, accustomed to long travels and many encounters, recognized the importance of marking significant events. He collected 3 white stones, rare in the marsh, and placed them beside the southern camp's fire, an offering that symbolized endurance, clarity, and continued vigilance. The southern group accepted these stones with gratitude, interpreting them as signs of solidarity. And so, these stones became part of their collective identity, a reminder that they were not alone, that others had witnessed their pain, and that memory could bind groups together just as fear could drive them apart. As days passed and tensions deepened, both camps found themselves creating new forms of ritual around memory. The northern camp began placing charred pieces of wood into a shared pile whenever a patrol returned safely, a symbolic gesture meant to honor the ancestors who protected them through the night. The southern camp began drawing patterns in the dust before dusk, circles, spirals, branching lines, hoping the land itself would remember their presence and ward off danger. Archaeological evidence from this transitional period shows similar patterns. Arranged stones near temporary settlements, decorative markings on tools, and burial sites appearing more structured than before. These early gestures of remembrance reflect a profound shift. Humans were beginning to understand that memories, especially memories tied to loss, held social power. They united people. They created caution. They shaped identity. The first true death of the marsh conflict came not from direct violence, but from the ripple effects of fear. In the northern camp, an elder named Karu fell from a wet ridge while scouting. His ankle broke upon the rocks, and though his group tended to him as best they could, infection set in quickly. The marsh was unforgiving. Within 2 days, he succumbed. His death changed the northern camp in ways nothing else had. Karu was respected for his stories, his calm judgment, his quiet humor. He had been one of the strongest voices urging peace. Now, his absence created a vacuum. His body, laid gently on a woven reed mat, was placed beside a small fire. The group gathered in a silent circle, each laying a hand upon his chest in farewell. It was the first funeral connected indirectly to the marsh conflict, though no southern weapon had touched him. His death came from the anxiety and urgency that fear had produced. Aruk spoke a few muted words that night. He shared memories of Karu teaching young hunters how to track gazelle, how to move with the wind rather than against it. In recounting these stories, Aruk solidified Karu's legacy. The group listened, tears reflecting the firelight. Through this ceremony, crude and instinctive as it was, the northern camp learned something that had never been so essential. Remembering the fallen helps the living endure. In the southern camp, the first death came days later, an infant born prematurely, weakened by stress and hunger. Though unrelated to violence directly, the group interpreted the loss as part of the conflict's cost. They mourned deeply, gathering around the tiny body wrapped in soft reeds. Tarama led a slow, rhythmic chant, calling upon ancestors to guide the child into the spirit world. The grief was raw, sharp, and immediate. And yet, in mourning together, the group found strength. Shared sorrow became shared identity. These early funerary practices, simple as they were, became the seeds of something monumental. They taught humans to mark death physically and symbolically, to remember those who passed, to connect loss with place. These rituals increased the emotional weight of conflict. Every injury now echoed in collective memory. Every death etched itself into the land. Territory was no longer just space. It became sacred by association. People remembered where Karu fell. They remembered where the infant was buried. They avoided those areas or visited them intentionally, letting memory guide their steps. And in these memories, the camps found both anchoring and justification. For the northern camp, Karu's death became a reminder to tread cautiously, to prevent further suffering. For the southern camp, their infant's loss hardened their determination not to be displaced or threatened again. Memory, in this early conflict, became both balm and blade. It soothed grief while sharpening resolve. It unified groups while deepening the divide between them. It preserved identity while accelerating the drift toward confrontation. By the time the marsh conflict approached its next turning point, remembrance had become inseparable from existence itself. Humans had learned that to remember the fallen was to define who they were, who they feared, and what they were willing to protect. What started as fear, misunderstanding, and territorial instinct was now evolving into something far more organized, far more deliberate. Humans, without realizing it, were learning from each encounter. They were watching, adapting, refining. And slowly, day by day, the scattered tension of the marsh was crystallizing into the first stirrings of strategy. This was the moment when skirmish began transforming into something structured, primitive, fragile, but unmistakably strategic. Across both camps, patterns emerged. People no longer waited for danger to happen to them. They tried to anticipate it. They studied the reeds for signs of movement. They mapped sound. They learned which patches of marsh carried footsteps and which swallowed them. Even the riverbend group, skilled in stealth, adjusted their methods based on the intricacies of the terrain. Humans were evolving not physically, but mentally, learning to plan, to coordinate, to forecast possibilities before they unfolded. It was the dawn of the tactical mind. The first true strategic behavior occurred quietly one morning when Aruk, still uneasy from Karu's death, took 2 northern hunters with him to survey the southern perimeter. He did not intend to provoke anything. He simply wanted information. But the way the group moved, dividing their path, one weaving through dense reeds while the others followed a raised patch of land, revealed a new kind of awareness. They understood that visibility mattered, that angles mattered, that safety depended on more than who carried the sharpest spear. It depended on who understood the landscape best. Archaeologists studying ancient conflict often find signs of such early strategic thinking: trails deliberately chosen for concealment, vantage points used repeatedly, camps positioned to maximize visibility. The marsh conflict shows these same behaviors. The northern scouts learned which reeds snapped loudly underfoot and which paths hid tracks. They approached the water's edge from the west, where morning light was behind them, making it harder for the southern scouts to see their silhouettes. These were not formal tactics, but their effectiveness etched them into memory. Meanwhile, the southern camp was developing its own strategies. Tarama, ever observant, noticed that the northern camp often sent scouts at dawn and again in late afternoon. She gathered the younger hunters and demonstrated how to use the sun's reflection on the water to spot movement far across the marsh. She guided them in marking locations where reeds shifted direction due to subtle water currents, places where an approaching figure would disturb the natural pattern. These were small insights, but profound. They turned the marsh into a living map, and the southern group learned to read it fluently. Strategy also evolved in weapon use. After the initial clash, the northern hunters began crafting darts with lighter shafts, meant to travel farther over the marsh's open pools. These darts were not intended for close combat. They were meant for warnings or for driving opponents back from a boundary. The southern group countered by shaping broader reed shields, reinforced with sinew, able to deflect glancing blows and protect against darts thrown from a distance. Both groups were adapting to the presence of the other, refining tools through repeated encounters. One of the first coordinated maneuvers occurred on an overcast afternoon when the southern camp, concerned about dwindling food supplies, attempted to harvest reeds from a patch dangerously close to the northern boundary line. Rather than sending a few gatherers, they arranged a structured effort. Scouts positioned at elevated points, gatherers arranged in pairs, a small group of hunters standing watch in the tall grass. This was not aggression, it was caution refined into formation. And when the northern scouts noticed the movement, they too adopted a formation. one approaching cautiously, the others spreading wide to avoid appearing as a clustered threat. What followed was not violence, but a delicate dance of strategy. Both sides observed, adjusted positions, communicated silently through gestures and posture. In that silent exchange, early humans learned something essential. Strategy was not only for attack, it was for prevention, for reading intent, for creating moments where conflict could be averted rather than escalated. But strategy also brought new risks. With organization came confidence, and confidence could be misread. A group moving in formation, even for defensive purposes, could appear threatening. A scout positioned at a vantage point could be interpreted as preparing an ambush. As humans learned to think tactically, they also learned that tactics could be misunderstood. And misunderstanding remained the marsh's most dangerous inhabitant. The Riverbend group played a unique role in this evolving landscape. Sinan, who had tried to mediate, recognized that strategy could stabilize or destabilize the marsh depending on how it was used. His group developed a practice of marking their scouting paths with subtle signs. Broken twigs angled a specific way, small piles of reeds, signals meant to communicate to others that they were observing, not preparing for battle. These signs were an early form of symbolic communication in conflict zones, an attempt to manage perception as much as reality. In the northern camp, leaders began discussing the idea of planned movement. They considered rotating watch positions, defining safe routes for water gathering, and creating contingency plans if the southern camp approached too near. These were early strategic concepts: scheduling, coordination, fallback options. Such ideas would later evolve into the complex hierarchies of warfare, but here, in the marsh, they were emerging in their rawest form. The southern camp also refined its own version of planning. Tarama emphasized the importance of timing, sending gatherers when the sun was high and shadows were short, timing fishing expeditions to coincide with moments when the northern scouts were typically elsewhere. She also encouraged her people to maintain flexibility, one path for gathering, another as backup. In essence, she introduced the idea of dynamic strategy, multiple plans shaped by changing circumstances. The marsh itself became an instructor. Humans learned that fog obscured movement, that wind masked sound, that reflections on the water could reveal silhouettes long before figures became visible. They used this knowledge to anticipate danger, to plan safe journeys, and sometimes to send subtle warnings. Conflict forced innovation. Innovation created advantage. Advantage required adaptation from the opposing side. Perhaps the most defining moment of early strategy occurred when both camps discovered they were tracking each other simultaneously along opposite sides of a narrow channel. Through the reeds, they could see only faint outlines. Neither side advanced, neither side retreated. Instead, they held their positions, each group mirroring the other's caution. After a long, tense stillness, both groups withdrew in perfect silence, as if guided by an unspoken rule. Not today. That moment represented the essence of strategy, not aggression, but choice. The choice to hold ground, the choice to observe, the choice to retreat. Humans were learning that control did not always come from force. Sometimes it came from restraint. Across the marsh, knowledge spread. People learned where the land dipped, where it rose, where sound carried. They shared observations. The reeds bend here differently. The water runs deeper near the center. Footsteps echo on the ridge. Each insight added to a growing collective intelligence, a proto-military awareness that would, in later ages, become the foundation of tactics, formations, ambush patterns, defensive planning. What was happening at the marsh was not yet war, but it was no longer random conflict either. It was conflict taking shape. By the end of the third week, the marsh was a web of strategic behaviors. Scouts moved with purpose. Gatherers stayed within safe lanes. Hunters trained for distance and precision. Leaders discussed possibilities days in advance. Groups adapted based on observed patterns. The marsh had become a living board, a place where every decision carried weight and every action could shape the next encounter. Humanity had begun the long journey from instinct to intention, from reaction to planning, from accidental clashes to strategic foresight. Skirmish was becoming strategy, and strategy was leading the marsh toward a decision point, a moment when deliberate action would become unavoidable. The first truce was approaching, but only because strategy had taught humans something new. Conflict could not continue forever without destroying everything they were trying to protect. People were exhausted, not just physically, not just from sleepless nights and constant vigilance, but from the emotional weight of existing in a state of unending readiness. Humans were not meant to live indefinitely at the knife's edge of fear. And so, as tension stretched thinner and thinner, it created a strange and unexpected opportunity, the chance for the first truce. A truce was not something either camp had planned. No one woke up thinking, "Today we will make peace." In fact, the idea of peace felt as fragile as reed paper, possible yet impossibly delicate. But peace often emerges not from bold declarations, but from fatigue, from grief, from the shared human recognition that constant fear corrodes everything it touches. Signs of exhaustion appeared first in the southern camp. Lala's fever finally broke one morning after nearly 20 days of drifting between life and death. When she opened her eyes and whispered Tarama's name, relief washed through the entire camp. Her survival felt like a gift, a message from the ancestors, a sign that not everything had to be shaped by conflict. For the first time in weeks, the southern camp felt something other than dread. They felt possibility. The northern camp experienced a similar shift. Aruk, haunted by guilt and weighed down by Karu's death, had begun speaking more openly about his desire to avoid further loss. Several northern hunters, particularly the younger ones, were surprised by how deeply Karu's absence hurt them. He had been a steady presence, a calming voice. His death, though unintended, though unrelated to a spear, had made the cost of continued tension too real to ignore. Even the Riverbend group felt this change. Senan watched both camps for signs of escalation and found none. Instead, he saw slower movement, quieter nights, more caution than aggression. The marsh itself seemed to sense the shift. Birds returned to shallower pools, fish swam closer to the banks, and the reeds, bent under weeks of constant passage, began to stand a little taller again. But the moment that truly set the truce in motion came from an unlikely source. A mistake. One gray morning, heavy with mist, a northern child wandered too far from the safety of the shelters while playing with a carved wooden toy. His mother had been preparing a basket of dried fish and hadn't noticed him slip away. The boy followed a trail of smooth stones along the marsh's edge, fascinated by their shapes, stones placed days earlier by his own group as boundary markers. But he was young. He didn't understand what the stones meant. He simply followed them like breadcrumbs, wandering farther and farther from camp until the mist swallowed him. In the southern camp, a young gatherer named Ari noticed movement near the reed line. At first, he thought it was a crane or heron, but when he crept closer, he saw the silhouette of a child, small, alone, shivering in the mist. Ari froze, torn between fear and compassion. He knew the child was northern. He also knew what would happen if he approached too quickly. So he crouched in the reeds and called softly, making soothing sounds meant to mimic the gentle hum that southern mothers used to calm their own children. The boy turned, startled but not afraid. Children, unlike adults, read intent more clearly. He stepped toward Ari, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Ari approached slowly, kneeling, offering the child his water skin. When the boy reached for it, Ari gently took his hand and led him back across the shallow mud toward the northern perimeter. Northern scouts spotted them before they arrived. Weapons rose, bodies tensed. Aruk himself rushed forward, heart pounding. But when he saw Ari holding the child's hand, not gripping, not dragging, but guiding, everything inside him softened. He stepped forward, placed a hand on his chest in a gesture of gratitude, and bowed his head. That simple act, the return of a child, did more to shift the marsh's direction than any strategy, any alliance, or any leader's speech. It cut through fear, cutting directly to something deeper, the universal understanding of care, of innocence, of protecting the young. For the first time, both camps saw not enemies across the reeds, but humans, people capable of compassion even in the shadow of conflict. News of the encounter spread quickly. The southern camp interpreted Ari's deed as a sign of the ancestors' favor, a message that peace was possible. The northern camp viewed Aruk's acceptance of the gesture as a moment of humility and strength, and the Riverbend group ever watchful, recognized this as the turning point they had been waiting for. Sinan approached the southern camp that evening with an idea. He gestured toward the open marsh and the low ridge between the camps, using sticks and marks in the dirt to propose a shared meeting place. Neutral ground, halfway between them, visible from both sides. He suggested that each camp send a small group, unarmed or minimally armed, to talk, to understand, to ease the tension before the marsh consumed them all. Tarama agreed immediately. She believed deeply in symbolic gestures, and she knew that a neutral meeting place could reset the narrative. Aruk, when approached, was reluctant at first, fearing a trap, fearing misunderstanding, fearing anything that put his group at risk. But the sight of his son, safe in his arms, softened his resistance. He agreed to go. The meeting place was chosen carefully. It lay along a shallow spit of land rising slightly above the marsh's waterline. Tall reeds bordered both sides, giving the area privacy, yet visibility. Sinan arrived first, standing calmly with his hands visible, a sign of neutrality. Tarama arrived next with 2 southern elders. Aruk arrived last, accompanied by 2 northern hunters who carried their spears but kept them pointed at the ground. The air was silent except for the gentle hiss of reeds swaying in the breeze. At first, there were only gestures, open hands, slow movements, pointing at the marsh, then back to themselves, then back to the marsh. Sinan used simple lines in the dirt to represent the camps. Tarama added small circles to represent resources. Aruk added marks showing scouting paths. Slowly, patiently, they built a shared understanding, not of language, but of intent. They agreed, wordlessly, to avoid certain boundary areas, to stagger gathering times, to keep children closer to camp, to signal their presence with smoke patterns instead of silent approaches. Small agreements, but enough to ease the constant fear. It was not a peace treaty as later civilizations would know it. It was fragile, thin, easily broken. But it was real. It was the first truce, and it worked, because everyone had finally understood the truth. Conflict cost too much. For several days, the marsh breathed easier. Children played again, though cautiously. Hunters returned with better catches. Gatherers brought home full baskets. People slept a little deeper. The reeds rustled with a softer sound. This early truce was not perfect. It would not last forever. But it carved itself deeply into human memory, teaching that between fear and violence there exists a narrow pathway, delicate yet vital, paved by gestures of trust. And through that pathway, humanity walked forward into the next chapter of its story. Long after the truce settled over the marsh like a fragile blanket, thin enough for fear to pierce, yet strong enough to keep violence at bay, another realization began to dawn on the people who lived through those days. It came slowly, like dawn creeping across the horizon. It came through memories carried in bone and in breath, through the stories whispered by firelight, through the quiet way elders gazed across the water and understood, perhaps for the first time, that something irreversible had entered the human story. The question that would echo through all future ages had been born. Why did war come into our world? And why has it never fully left us? The marsh conflict, small in scale, brief in duration, and limited in casualties, became the blueprint for everything that followed. Not because it was glorious, there was no glory in it. Not because it was decisive, nothing was conquered. And not because it was monumental, only a handful of people even witnessed it. But because it revealed, with startling clarity, the forces inside the human experience that make organized violence both possible and persistent. Fear, territory, memory, identity, alliances, survival, each of these had shaped the conflict. And each, as the truce faded into routine, remained living undercurrents that would never fully disappear. In the weeks that followed the meeting on neutral ground, the marsh settled into an uneasy but functioning balance. The northern and southern camps moved with new caution, using signals and paths agreed upon during the truce. The Riverbend group resumed its travels, but left behind symbolic markers, white stones shaped into simple spirals that reminded anyone who passed through that peace could be chosen, even when conflict felt inevitable. But the story did not end in harmony. Peace, fragile as it was, existed only because the pressures that caused conflict had momentarily eased. The marsh's resources bounced back with the warming season, herds returned, fish were plentiful, and Lala, though still weak, survived, her wound healing slowly, leaving a deep scar that would speak of that season for the rest of her life. Aruk, too, found a measure of peace within himself. The guilty boar no longer tormented him with the same sharpness. Instead, it transformed into a quiet determination to protect his people through wisdom rather than reaction. He watched the marsh each morning from the ridge, listening to the birds, feeling the wind shift, sensing the land's pulse. He understood something new. Peace required as much vigilance as conflict. Tarama also changed. Once a healer and guide, she had become something more, someone who carried not just knowledge but memory, someone who could foresee the consequences of fear and guide her people through moments even leaders could not navigate. Her voice shaped the southern camp, not through authority, but through trust. And yet, even with these steadying influences, the marsh remained a fragile place. The truce did not erase the territorial lines etched in dust. It did not undo the stories already told or soften the memories carved into bone. When the season ended, the camps parted ways. The northern group traveled upstream to higher ground. The southern group moved east toward drier plains. The riverbend group dissolved into the horizon. But they carried the marsh with them. They carried its fear. They carried its lessons. They carried the awareness that humans could organize not only for hunting and gathering, but for confrontation. They carried the knowledge that territory could be defined, defended, and contested. They carried the memory of the fallen, Karu, the infant, those harmed indirectly by fear. And memory, once awakened, travels wherever people go. This is how war spreads, not as a fire raging across continents, not as a sudden transformation, but as a handful of ideas embedded in the minds of people who carry them into new landscapes. A group that had once experienced conflict now saw strangers differently. They interpreted unfamiliar markings with more suspicion. They approached new territories with more caution. They strengthened boundaries earlier, sharpened tools sooner, watched the horizon longer. As generations passed, the marsh conflict became story, then legend, then something deeper. A cautionary tale woven into origin myths, influencing how children understood the world. And as more groups across different regions experienced their own conflicts, sparked by scarcity, misunderstanding, or ambition, the lessons crystallized across humanity until they formed a collective pattern recognizable in every era. The reason war never fully left us is not because humans are cruel by nature, nor because violence is inevitable. It is because the conditions that birthed the first conflict, fear, proximity, competition, memory, are deeply human. They sit at the intersection of survival and imagination. They do not disappear with time. Instead, they resurface whenever groups feel threatened, whenever resources tighten, whenever identity becomes tied to place or belief. War persists because it is learned, remembered, passed down as warning and strategy. But so is peace. The marsh taught that too. The first truce revealed something essential. Humans are capable of stepping back from the brink. We are capable of recognizing the cost of violence and choosing restraint. We can see ourselves in others. We can negotiate without a shared language. We can return a lost child rather than use him as leverage. These acts are remarkable precisely because they are choices, not instincts. Archaeologists studying ancient conflict sites often find evidence of both violence and cooperation in the same layers of soil. Broken spear points lie beside shared hearths. Defensive positions stand near areas of trade. Burials of the fallen are found beside symbols of peace. Humanity has always lived between these forces, never entirely surrendered to one or the other. So why did war remain? Because the same intelligence that allowed our ancestors to build alliances, plan strategies, and remember the fallen also allowed them to build hierarchies, organize larger groups, and pursue more ambitious claims over land and resources. The marsh conflict taught early humans how to coordinate in defense, but coordination can easily become offense when fear evolves into ambition. And yet, the truce taught something equally enduring. Conflict is not destiny. Violence is not instinct. It is context. It is pressure. It is learned behavior shaped by circumstance. If war emerged because of fear, misunderstanding, and hunger, then peace emerged because of compassion, memory, and the simple act of returning a child. As the marsh settled into history, its lessons rippled outward, echoing across valleys, plains, and forests for thousands of years. Each generation would face its own crossroads, shaped by the same forces that once transformed the reed beds into a crucible of early conflict. Humans would continue to fight, but also to reconcile. They would draw boundaries, but also cross them. They would remember the fallen, but also remember those who chose peace when conflict seemed inevitable. The First War did not define humanity. What defined us was the moment we stepped back, the moment we chose to speak with gestures instead of spears, the moment we saw ourselves in a stranger's frightened eyes. Why war never left us is the same reason peace never left us. Both are part of our inheritance. Both live within us, waiting for the conditions that call them forth. The marsh taught early humans that conflict could be organized, but it also taught them that peace could be, too. And in that fragile balance, held for the first time 14,000 years ago, lies the true beginning of our long, complicated story.